All right, this is the follow up, and we are following up today on a live video I did a couple months ago in 2020, last year, entitled "Show Preparation STAX." And my guest today on the follow up is the guitar player of the STAX show that we were associated with, the great George Naha. Am I pronouncing your name correctly?
Naha is usually
Naha, okay, the great George Naha. George, thank you so much for making yourself available and welcome to the follow up.
George. It's great to be here and great to see you.
Excellent, same here. All right, so for those watching, for those listening, let me just give you a little bit of a breakdown into George's and mine history together. I get a kick out of talking to someone whose name is also George. This is awesome.
Makes it easy. You don't
Yeah,
forget.
right. So
Made for some
um,
funny moments at the rehearsals,
it
though.
it really did. Yeah, it really did. I mean, at the we George and I were working on a workshop for a musical theater piece about Stax, about the record company Stax, and featuring the music that came out of the Stax label. And during the workshop, there were many moments when the MD was trying to give us notes and called out our first name, George, and we would both answer at the same time. It would confuse him very much.
It's
Which,
stereo going on.
so exactly. Of course, the minute we understood that it was confusing him, we just went for it and used it to our advantage all the time. Which was the greatest thing.
That was a
It's
lot
the,
of fun.
That was a lot of fun because that, I mean, in all seriousness, like that doesn't happen that often with when you're in a situation with someone who has the same first name. But coming back to the subject at hand, the Stacks show, the Stacks workshop that we worked on, um, it was again, it was around. It was about the Stax label, and it featured the music from that label, meaning it featured songs originally done by Sam and Dave, Carla Thomas, um, all of them played by Booker T and the MGs, sung by acts like Otis Redding, Eddie Floyd. Um, Let me see, who am I leaving out? I'm leaving Funky Chicken Singer out. Who was that?
Rufus Thomas.
Rufus Thomas. Thank you. All
Yeah.
right. So George, him being a guitar player, had the task to get as close as possible to the guitar stylings of Steve Cropper. And me being a bass player, I had to get as close as possible to the bass stylings of Doc Dunn. And I thought that George would be a great guest on the follow up because he did that workshop with me. And he actually has history with those two gentlemen and with artists from the Stax label. So, George, let me open it up to you.
Sure.
What was your first introduction? And I understand that this is perhaps a larger subject, but what was your first introduction to Stax, and how did that all of that come about?
This goes way back. I was in my 20s,
Mm-hmm.
and I did this gig. We were backing up this young guy that did an Elvis act,
Right.
and we didn't play behind him very well. I think he left the stage in tears, but that's another story. It wasn't rehearsed, and he had no charts, so
Oh, great.
it's kind of like one of those gigs.
Yeah, yeah.
And but there were a couple of guys playing with us that night. A trombonist named Pete Maurer and a trumpet player named John Pratt. They were
Right.
working with Sam and Dave.
Check that out.
So Pete goes to me. He goes, "Give me your number," because Sam and Dave they're looking for another guitar player. He
Mm.
goes, "I think they would like the way you play." So a week or two later, I got a call, and I went out and bought the Greatest Hits album, and I sat there and I went, "Oh my!" I mean, I knew some of Sam and Dave's songs.
Right.
All of a sudden, I'm hearing great song after great song. I was just like, I was entranced.
Right.
And of course, Cropper's guitar work was just like, wow, this stuff is just fabulous.
Right. Right.
So I shedded that stuff like crazy. And my audition for the band, I went to see them play. I think they had a gig in Mamaroneck.
Hmm.
and there was a balcony. I'm up in the balcony watching the band play, you know, and the road manager comes up and he goes, "Hey man, can you cut this funk?" I go, "Yeah." He goes, "All right, we'll see you at the rehearsal." So
Wow.
that was my audition. You know, I answered the question. I didn't say, "I can't do this," you know. So
Well,
I got the gig, and
very, very straightforward. Like immediately, yeah, I got this. I
yeah.
got this, and
So
that's it.
so so I went out on the road with them.
Hmm.
They this was in their very last stages of getting along together at all,
Hmm.
and they had their very last breakup towards the end of our tour. A matter of fact, we were doing a gig in Texas, and they had a little bit of a confrontation on stage, which went on mic
Mm.
into the audience, and then they announced this is the end of our tour, and that was the end of Sam and Dave as a duo. That was
Oh
the very
wow.
last time they worked together. But I stayed with Sam, and I wound up eventually becoming Sam's musical director,
Okay.
and I traveled around the world with him, and through that I started working with all the STAX artists. I worked with Pickett, I worked with Carla Thomas, I worked with Rufus Thomas and Eddie Floyd. I did,
Mm.
I got to know all these people. And then eventually I got to start playing with Cropper and Duck some,
Right.
which was all of a sudden, like,
I mean, you were
you've
in
been
it.
playing, you've been listening to these records for years, and then you're standing next to Cropper going, wow. So
Yeah.
that's why those records sounded so good, because he
Oh
was
yeah.
on them.
Oh yeah, 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 yeah. Most definitely. Well, I
So
mean, what a story! What a story! Incredible, incredible. Please continue.
So, I did that for quite a while. I was in that genre of all those artists because a lot of the soul artists and the R&B artists, they were around New York and New Jersey.
Right.
So Don Covey was another guy that I wound up working with, and
Mm.
it was just I was immersed in that world for a lot of years.
Mm.
So when we got the call for the workshop, John Miller called up, and it was funny. He goes to me, "George, it's STAX. Who else would I call?" So I laughed. I thought that was funny. But then when I went to the rehearsals, I felt like, well, I've got a little bit of a leg up because I've been studying these records for 40 years.
Yeah, for sure. For sure.
And a couple of times it was funny, like the chart had varied a little bit. They rearranged things a little bit.
Right.
But in my mind, I'm still hearing like the old Otis Redding records. And I said, oh, I'm playing what's on the record. I'm not playing what's on the music. I should
Yeah,
start
yeah, yeah,
looking
yeah,
at
yeah,
the
yeah, yeah.
paperwork.
Yeah. I mean, that's that kind of came with the difficulty of turning this material into a musical theater show, and
Right.
this you cannot possibly play every song the way it was recorded.
Sure.
You have to sort of distill it down to its bare essence,
Hmm.
and then especially when it comes to form, as is,
Right.
you can definitely quote the original, like for me the original bass line, for you the original guitar parts, right?
Hmm.
And you should, there's just no two ways about it, because they're at this point they're totally iconic with these songs, and to a certain degree immediately trigger something in the audience,
Hmm.
memories, sounds, whatever. um, but most of the time, yeah, the form of the songs gets chopped up, and it does present itself with its unique sets of difficulties, because as you said, like, we are so used to hearing the songs
Right.
beginning to end, right?
Right. And yeah, so there might have been a couple of things in the workshop where, there was a song on the song list, and I go, oh, I've got this one from top to bottom. I know this one note for note. And then you go, oh, it's a 17-second underscore.
Right.
So you go,
Right.
okay. And we're playing it whisper quiet.
Right.
So if there was something where Cropper was really laying into something, you go, well, I
Mm.
really can't lay into that like this because
Mm.
now we're underneath everything.
Oh
So,
yeah.
you,
Oh
so
yeah,
but,
yeah.
as we go on as musicians, we just have to develop that flexibility to say, well, I know what the original part was, or the original intent of this record, but now we have to adapt it to a new venue here, to this
Right.
show
Right.
type of thing.
Right, to a new environment. Totally, absolutely, 100%. Now, one thing that I wanted to talk to you about, because
Hmm.
you are somewhat of a specialist when it comes to that particular style that comes from that era and also that location.
Hmm.
Um, when I was getting my bits and pieces together about the show, I had listened to Booker T, of course, Booker T
Hmm.
and the MGs. I had listened to Sam and Dave. Sam and Dave are my favorite STAX artists, not taking anything away from anybody else, but those two just do it for me. Um, and very often I noticed when talking to other musicians the sort of confusion between Stax, Muscle Shoals, Fame, right?
Mm-hmm.
All those labels that sort of came out of the same environment surrounding Memphis, around Tennessee, the Mississippi, and all of that, right?
Mm-hmm.
What is your take on how would you define the output of these three labels? Like, what puts one, or what is the difference between those three labels?
It's good. It's a great question, and there, of course, there were similarities. They all had that kind of southern, laid back,
Mm-hmm.
earthy,
Mm-hmm.
organic feel.
Mm-hmm.
Um, they were all recorded. All those records were recorded pretty live.
Yeah.
Like I know the Stack studio on Macklemore it was a sound. They built it into a sound stage,
Right.
and they had everything just set up like almost like a live gig, and that stuff didn't move.
Right.
Similar to the Motown thing, where they had, in Motown they had everybody sat at a certain place.
Right. Right.
Allegedly on the Motown board, there was a sign that said, "We make hits here.
Right.
Don't touch anything,"
Right.
because they found the sound.
Right.
But it's interesting. Like as a guitar player, I listen a lot to the differences between some of those players.
Right.
Like with the Muscle Shoals guys, one of the main guys was Reggie Young,
Right.
and Reggie was a master at finding like the lick that could just set off a song.
Mm.
I think in a sense, when I'm saying this as a guitar player, Reggie Young could play some fairly complex stuff,
Right.
and I don't know if Steve Cropper played as with the complexity that Reggie did, but Steve also had that ability. He could play two notes,
Mm.
and those two notes define the song.
Right.
You would hear that one lick, and you go, "Wow!" and you would never forget that lick.
Mm.
So I think one of the things about all those labels and all those studios was the organic, earthy quality to it. No one was really playing to impress somebody else.
Mm. Check that out.
It was just like, let's find something that feels really, really good
Right.
and go with it. And it's funny, like, when I was a kid and I listened to the early Aretha stuff on Atlantic,
Mm.
who knew that was a bunch of like white guys from down south playing those records? Because in our mind's eye, we could
Right.
just imagine like the later bands with Cornell Dupree
Of
and
course. Of
Purdy
course. Yeah.
and
Yeah.
Chuck Rainey. But then you see who actually played those records, and you go, "Wow, okay." So that was something I never realized when I was a kid, that these guys, they could lay down some serious funk.
Oh yeah.
But none of them were really super technical players.
Right. Right.
You know?
Right. 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 No, that's a very very interesting point. I mean, and that kind of gets me to the next idea that sort of helped me preparing for this particular show. And when you do a deep dive into a particular style, right? Me as a bass player, as a bass player, you have to learn Doc Dunn's style because he was a very iconic player. You have to learn Jameson's style, right? Again, totally iconic player, who influenced everybody else. Who influenced Doc Dunn, mainly because Dunn was like, I'm not doing what he's doing. I'm gonna go a different direction, right? And that's kind of where I think your insight would be totally valuable, because you have worked with them. You worked with Cropper and with Dunn. What was their process? What was their process in figuring out parts? I mean, I have the answer for that myself, but I want to hear it from you. That's important.
Well, it's funny, like when you said about Duck and Jamerson, I think one of the things with those two guys in particular, James Jamerson was kind of coming out of he was like at heart, I believe, a jazz musician.
Oh yeah, most definitely.
And Duck was coming out of more like maybe rock and roll and country.
Right.
So, but I mean, I've heard Duck play some things where he was walking through some changes, but he didn't have that thing that Jamerson had of like super virtuosic.
Right.
Just, but one funny thing, we were doing a gig years ago, And Duck was one of the funniest people I ever met. Very
Mm.
warm-hearted guy and very humble. Um, we were working for this, rehearsing for this presidential inaugural for George Herbert Walker Bush.
Okay.
And what song was it we were doing? We were doing a version of Otis's version of, was it Respect? No, it was the other one, Satisfaction. Otis had
Okay.
done his version of Satisfaction. And Duck goes to me, George, because he was such a Southerner. He goes, George, I
Right.
forget what I played on this record. Uh, and I go, well, Duck, I have a chart. I wrote out your bass part. Would you like to see it? He goes, So I put the music on the stand. He looks at it. He goes, damn, George, now I'm going to have to learn to read me some notes, ain't I? I go,
Oh.
no, it's okay, Duck. I said, you basically played quarter notes on the roots, and then when you got to this other part, you opened it up a little bit, but a lot of it was just quarter notes on the roots. He goes, you sure? I go,
Mm.
yeah, I listened to it a lot. I wrote it out. He goes, all right. So he plays it, and he sounded great. I mean, he sounded like Duck Dunn. It was like, wow,
Right.
this guy plays so great.
Right.
We finished the rehearsal. He goes, George. I go, what? You should have got you the live record of Otis. I got up to eighth notes by then. And so
Yes.
he was just a very humble guy. And one of the things you realize with STAX is they were in no hurry to cut a track.
I'll check that out.
No one else used the studio but them.
Wow.
You know, we get used to being in New York where they
Right.
go, guys, you got 3 hours.
Right. Right.
You know, the
right,
guys
right.
are coming in to do an Alpo commercial after this. Come on, we got to get out of here. You know,
Yeah,
whatever's
yeah.
going on. It's
Yeah.
like that time is money type of thing.
Right.
So you have to kind of put things together quickly. Those guys, they would do many, many, many takes. And they just
Mm.
sat around. They'd have a lunch break. You know, they weren't in that. When you read sometimes about the way the Beatles recorded, they
Mhm.
took a very long time to make those records.
Mm.
And same thing with the guys in Memphis. It was very organic. It was
Right.
they tried something
Right.
and they say, well, I don't know. They tried something else, and then it grew. So it's this
Mhm.
very natural process where they just experimented, and they weren't. I think the beautiful thing about the way they recorded back then, especially with Stax, they weren't in a hurry.
Yeah.
They had the studio.
Yeah.
They weren't
Yeah.
going anywhere.
Right.
They had a good amount of time just to relax and
Mm.
try things and get something that by the time they were done, you go, "Pff, that's just a fabulous recording."
Right.
And,
Right.
and
Right. Right.
the thing with Duck and Cropper, number one, they both had great sound.
Yeah.
They both had great time.
Right.
And they both could find those signature licks that when you like you did a deep dive into Duck, some of this, like if you listen to Walking the Dog,
Oh
you
yeah.
know, he's doing the one part through the record, and at the end he starts doing that chromatic thing at the
Right.
end.
Right.
And it's
Right.
like,
Right.
where did that come from?
Right.
But you know, I remember seeing Duck playing with Cropper and Booker T at the old Lone Star, not the old one on 13th Street, but when they moved to 52nd Street.
Mm-hmm.
And one thing that struck me, by the end of the song, he was playing something way different than what he played at the beginning. His bass lines told stories.
Okay. Okay.
You know, so those guys didn't live in a cut and paste world. You know, this is one of the troubles our modern world is cut and paste.
Yeah.
You found something for the first verse, it's on your computer. Just
Right.
say, I'm just going to move that into every verse.
It doesn't.
It's-
There's a loss of dynamic. There's a loss
Yeah.
of growth. You know
Yeah,
that perhaps happens naturally, especially with those songs and the way they were recorded.
Right.
Because you
Yeah.
know they embellish, they change certain parts, they add certain things, they leave certain parts. You know, take certain parts out. You know.
Sure.
I thought that was always the fascinating thing about Stax, the process of elimination, you know,
Mhm.
because it seemed to me like when they finally arrived after all that, and that's why I said I know the answer to that question, but when they arrived at the end result, right, they had eliminated everything that in their minds didn't work. Like,
Sure.
they just stripped it down, right? They trimmed all the fat. They came to the bare essence of what the grooves were or what the songs were really,
Mhm.
and ran with that. That process of elimination makes that output, in my opinion, very, very unique.
hmm
because it,
Mhm.
that certainly did not happen in Motown, and it didn't happen in New York or anything
Right.
like that. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I believe it's true because, I mean, Motown, which was in a way much more, and I'm not saying this to any judgmental sense,
Hmm.
sophisticated.
Yeah,
I mean, they had the three guitar players,
yeah.
and those three guitar players were like this beautiful little string section. The way
Oh
they
yeah.
worked together, and but it was funny. One thing I always thought about Motown was they kept a kind of a clear field because they had the greatest open field runner in the history of music in James Jamerson.
Right.
So it was kind of like, Jim Brown back in football.
Mm.
If he saw the littlest opening, he could just get through it. So they left a lot of room for Jamerson in
Mm.
Motown.
Mm.
And because his bass lines were unlike anything I really ever heard before that.
Yeah. Yeah.
He's kind of like the godfather of modern bass. Sometimes I say like he was the Charlie Parker
Oh yeah.
of of,
Oh yeah.
of, of electric bass back then, because you wouldn't notice it until you really started listening to it going, because the records just felt great. You think, wow, that is a great record. When you
Yeah.
really start to listen to what he's playing, go, oh my God,
Yeah.
listen
Yeah.
to what this genius is doing at the very bottom of this song.
Yeah.
And right away at the bottom of a lot of Motown songs, there was this complexity.
Yeah.
And a lot of those guys were jazz players, Earl Van Dyke. All those guys were very, very, sophisticated players. So a lot of that came in to
Mhm.
their arrangements.
Right.
But with Stax, it was more like, well, that's the way those guys are working in Detroit. We have our sound. We
Exactly.
don't sound like that. We
Right.
play like the way we play.
Right.
Same thing with High Records and Teeny Hodges.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. I wasn't. I couldn't think of the name. But I wanted to include them into all the labels that I mentioned earlier. High Records, of course. Teeny Hodges. Yes. 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 Most
You know,
definitely.
there were some things that just like no one else quite played like those guys on the high record labels.
Right.
So,
Right.
and it was funny. We talk about regional musics. Well, these two studios were both in Memphis, but one guy, 5 blocks away or however far, but they played differently in
They
both
they
studios.
totally sounded differently. Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's a fascinating thing. There is an underlying current that has sort of crept into my live videos on George's Space Chat, and
Uh-huh.
that is the regionality of African American music and therefore American music, right?
Hmm.
Like the fact that bass players, people that my peers that I grew up, but that I met along the way, you know, from New Jersey sound completely different than this player over here who, is from West Virginia originally, or that
Hmm.
player over here that's from New Orleans, originally. And all of that, the regionality of the sound was a big, big factor. And certainly, um, did they ever, certainly influenced a lot of music. Did
Hmm.
did Steve Cropper, Doug Dunn, did they ever talk about this? What was this something that was on their minds, or was it just something that they did and without really thinking about it too much?
That's a good question. Duck was when I would hang out with Duck and talk. He was more just like he never talked that much about the process of making music.
Right.
He was more humorous and more just talking about everyday life.
Mm-hmm.
And he did tell me that at one point his wife started yelling at him to convince him to finally change his strings
Oh
because
wow.
he had those flat wound strings on there for many years. He goes, George, man, June finally got me to get. She said, get a set of round wounds. So, so but he never really talked about the process of making things. Now, Steve, Steve really played with the producer's head.
Right.
I mean, the way he thought about music, he was what they would have called in the old days a record man.
Right.
He wasn't into showing all the stuff that he knew,
Right.
but he really thought about what's going to make this record sound
Mm.
good.
Mm.
And since he co-wrote a lot of those great songs, he wrote with Pickett, he wrote with Otis. His name is on a lot of those records.
Right.
He's more open about talking and there's a lot of interviews with him on YouTube and floating around of him discussing specific songs.
Right.
Like when he was having what was it? It was Midnight Hour. He was talking about there was a certain dance at the time that they kind of did this. I forget what dance that was, but this
Mm-hmm.
happened with the arms.
Right.
And he said, Well, that was a popular dance style, so I wanted to try to come up with a groove that felt like that.
Right,
So
right, 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 right.
so he was really thinking about like what's really going to make this thing happen, and then can I find like the simplest little lick, lay it down in the exact right spot with the great sound,
Mm.
and just it becomes an iconic lick,
Oh
you
wow.
know.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
And
yeah,
so
yeah. This is, yeah, very much so. Very much so. That's incredible. There's aside from the regionality of sounds, there is this underlying current that I've held throughout last year, and
mhm,
that's going into this year as well, and that is the fact, or kind of introducing the idea to the audience, that what we hear in those recordings
mhm,
was, of course, to a certain extent, the outcome of happy accidents, right?
mhm.
But very, very often was very specifically crafted for a particular song,
Oh,
right?
sure,
So
sure,
what you're saying about Cropper right now is speaks exactly to that point, that he actually thought about this. I know from documentaries and talking to Otis Williams from the Temptations, like
hmm,
the Funk Brothers spent a good deal of time, thinking about some stuff, right?
right,
And figuring out, like, conceptualizing the three guitar players, together. Of course, with Jameson, like, he was kind of the sole bass player. Like, there was
mhm.
nobody else to talk to at that point.
Imagine if they had a second bass player on the track.
was that's a lot. I mean, some stations did have two bass players, but
Uh-huh.
yeah, for the most part, it was just him.
Yeah,
But they came up with parts, right?
sure,
It didn't leave it up it just didn't come from anywhere. It didn't come, from the air or anything like
sure,
that. It was crafted, right?
right.
That is a big um, change in perception of what makes this music so great.
Hmm.
And perhaps lastly, excuse me, the thing that I noticed, you know, I heard Booker T and the MGs at the old BB King's
Hmm.
on 42nd Street, right?
Hmm.
Um, the thing that was noticeable, like, from the very first note on, was the the amount of energy that they pushed off the stage, right?
Hmm.
As in just in terms of tightness, in terms of sound, in terms of choices of notes. What did that feel like to you when you were on stage with them?
When we did that the gig that I did when Duck and with Cropper, it was that inaugural thing. They had a great band. I mean,
Right.
um, it was everywhere I looked, it was like, wow, how'd I get on this all star team?
Yeah.
Like, am I the ball boy or something? Like, Mr. Cropper, here's your bat. It's like, but playing with those guys, it was the easiest thing in the world
Mm,
because each of them is so strong in what they do
right.
that it's like they don't play with an ounce of doubt in their playing.
Mm.
It's just like like Steve had a great story about Al Jackson. He loved Al Jackson,
Oh yeah.
and he said Al's thing was I'm the drummer, I'm the time.
Right.
And Steve said if you were ever doing a rehearsal or something or at a session and you go, Al, maybe the tempo of this could be a little bit slower or faster. I think the time moved a little bit.
Mm.
Steve said you had to get ready to duck because he would just take one of his drumsticks and throw it at your head as hard as he could because he said, I'm the time.
Right. Of course. Of
And
course.
Steve, who has great time, he attributes his time to all those years of playing with Al
Yeah.
because he said Al had the greatest time of anybody he ever worked with. And he
Yeah.
just, and that's another thing I was thinking about. These rhythm sections that we talk about, whether it's Muscle Shoals or Motown or Stax or High Records, these guys played together every day.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
there was just this communal thing of like every day they were seeing each other in the studio and just
Right.
playing.
Right.
So that actually helped foster the individual styles of each of these rhythm sections.
Right.
It
Right.
wasn't so much like call this guy, call this guy, call this guy. It was like here's the fellas,
Right.
and they
Right.
were just
Right. Right. Right.
playing every day, and that helped to define the sound. But Cropper's time, you know, he's got great time. I remember years ago, was this it? This was at the Lone Star on 52nd Street. My Jerry Jamad, who's a dear old friend of mine,
Yeah.
was playing bass that one night with Dave Keys, the keyboardist, and then Booker T played. And I think maybe I forget what happened. Maybe something happened to Duck's bass, so Jerry let like Duck play his bass for the thing. But we were up in this balcony just watching a Booker T play, and Jerry just goes, points at Cropper, goes, he's got good time.
Mm.
So all those guys, they played with this, because half the thing about time is just confidence.
Right.
You know, the
Yeah.
minute you lose your confidence, you get wobbly.
Yeah.
You're
Totally.
thinking,
Totally.
is this where it really is, or is it? So, but those guys didn't play like that. They
Mm.
just, here it is.
Oh,
They
that's
just
so
played.
deep.
So playing with them, it was like Brian Brake used to joke around with sometimes when a couple of us would sub on Smokey Joe's Cafe years ago. Brian would see us come in, he goes, "Oh, we're going to ride in Uncle Joe's Cadillac today," you know. So, so, so but playing with those guys, it was like you're sitting in the Cadillac. It's just
Right.
like this thing's just rolling down the road. It was like
Right.
this is the easiest time I've ever had playing music in my life
Mm.
with these guys.
That's incredible.
Yeah, there
That
was
is
no
incredible.
equivocation. It was just like, here it is.
Yeah. Just no doubts about it, no hesitation, no nothing. And that's really, I mean, that me being on the other side, you know, in the audience,
Uh-huh.
that's exactly what came off the stage.
Sure.
There
Yeah.
was no hesitation. It was, I don't want to use the word, you know, steam engine or anything, but it definitely felt like this machine was coming at you, and in the best possible way, it's coming
Yeah,
at you,
no.
and you're just standing there because it feels so good, and you just want to let this roll over you, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's yeah, again, like that's what I'm interested in here in this series of videos is perspective. Like you're on stage, I'm in the audience. We're
Mm-hmm.
experiencing the same situation, but
Right.
you know, you're experiencing it from your vantage point. I'm experiencing it from my point of view, or from my situation, right? So perfect. That's what a great memory to share with us. Thank you so much for doing that.
Oh,
Seriously, this is
George, it's a pleasure to see you, and you know, hopefully one of these days I'll see you without a screen in between us,
yes,
and we'll have
indeed.
instruments in our hands.
Yeah, and we'll confuse the hell out of some MD
Yeah.
again.
Let's go get somebody else.
Yeah, I think that'd be awesome. Well, listen, George Naha, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank
I
you.
really appreciate your time, your effort, your availability. I wish you all the best. You know, stay safe out there, stay sane out there. You know, continue doing what you're doing because we certainly need more of that around. And
Well, thank you so much, Rich. Thanks for having me. Thanks for opening up some time for me to come in and discuss this with you.
oh, absolutely, my pleasure. This has been invaluable. So thanks again, George. Take it
Oh, it was
easy.
absolutely my pleasure, George.
All right, later.
Okay.